A quiet cabin, nestled deep in the woods of Northern California. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place of peace, of quiet, of second chances. The kind of place where the only sounds at night are the whisper of the wind through the pines and the steady hum of crickets beneath the moon. Where families gather on the porch after dinner, watching the last traces of daylight disappear behind the treetops. Where life moves a little slower, a little safer. That's what Sue Sharp believed when she moved her family here. A single mother, raising her children on her own, trying to carve out a better life after a difficult past. She had left behind an unhappy marriage, taken her kids, and found refuge in Keddie, a small town with no more than a few hundred residents, where everyone knew everyone, and where trouble was supposed to be a distant thought. She rented Cabin 28, a modest home, nothing remarkable, but it was enough. It was home. And for a while, everything seemed fine. Days passed in the usual way. The older kids made friends, the younger ones played outside until the streetlights flickered on. There were dinners at the kitchen table, laughter that echoed through the small cabin, the warmth of a mother trying to make things work despite the odds stacked against her. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Then came the night of April 11, 1981. The evening started like any other. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air. The television buzzed softly in the background. Conversations and quiet moments played out behind the walls of Cabin 28. In a nearby home, neighbors went about their usual routines, oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. At some point in the night, something changed. It wouldn't be until the next morning that anyone realized it. Wouldn't be until the sun was already stretching over the horizon, casting light on something that should have never been seen. Wouldn't be until a young girl, returning home from a sleepover, reached for the front door, and stepped inside. What she saw in that moment, the sheer, unfathomable horror of it, would never leave her. 3 bodies. Lifeless. Tied, beaten, left in a way that suggested nothing about this was random. The cabin, so full of warmth and life the night before, was now silent, cold. But something was wrong. There were supposed to be more people inside. And yet, one was missing. As authorities arrived, as investigators stepped over the threshold and into the scene, it became clear that this was not just an act of violence. This was something else entirely. No one saw it coming. No one heard the screams. And yet, someone had done this. Someone had walked into that cabin in the middle of the night, knowing exactly what they intended to do. And whoever they were never caught. More than 4 decades have passed since that night, but the shadows of what happened in Cabin 28 have never faded. The case remains open, the questions unanswered. How could something so brutal, so deliberate, unfold in a place so small without anyone knowing who was responsible? How could a case so horrifying leave behind so many clues, yet still no justice? To understand what happened, to even begin piecing together the fragments of that night, we have to go back. Back to where it all began. The town of Keddie sat quietly in the Sierra Nevada mountains, tucked away from the rush of city life. It wasn't a place of grand expectations or busy streets, just a collection of cabins and trailers, a handful of families who knew each other by name, and a landscape that seemed untouched by time. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine, and the sound of rustling leaves was one of the only things that broke the silence at night. It was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors, where neighbors waved as they passed each other on the narrow roads, where the biggest concerns were the occasional power outage or a bear rummaging through the garbage. It wasn't perfect, but it was simple. It was home to those who wanted a quiet life, to those looking for a place to start over. For Sue Sharp, Keddie was supposed to be a fresh start. She had come from Connecticut, leaving behind a marriage that had become impossible, choosing instead to raise her 5 children on her own. It wasn't an easy decision, but she had done it for them, for a chance at something better, something stable. With little money and few options, she had moved to Northern California and settled into a cabin in the Keddie Resort, a collection of rental homes nestled in the woods. Cabin 28 wasn't anything special, just a modest structure with a small porch, a living room barely big enough for the family, a kitchen where Sue cooked simple meals. It was worn, a little cramped, but it was enough. Sue did the best she could. She was quiet but strong, determined to give her kids a life that felt as normal as possible. Her oldest, John, was 15, a teenager finding his way, spending time with his best friend, Dana Wingate, a boy who had seen his own struggles but always carried a bright energy. Then there was Sheila, the responsible one, the second in command when her mother needed help. Tina, at 12, still clung to a bit of childhood innocence, caught between wanting to grow up and holding on to the comforts of being a kid. The younger boys, Greg and Rick, were too little to understand much beyond the walls of their home, their world still filled with cartoons and backyard adventures. That night, April 11, 1981, was like any other. It was a Saturday, the kind of day that passed without much thought. The kids spent time outside, running between cabins, talking with friends. The older boys, John and Dana, had been in town earlier, hitchhiking like they often did, a common thing in small communities where everyone knew each other. By evening, they had made their way back to cabin 28, ready to settle in for the night. Inside, the house carried the usual warmth of family life. The television flickered, casting a soft glow across the living room. The faint smell of dinner still lingered in the air. Conversations overlapped, small talk, laughter, the sound of kids moving between rooms. Sheila had plans to stay the night at a friend's house, just across the way. The younger boys, Greg and Rick, along with their friend Justin, had already started to wind down, their voices growing quieter as sleepiness crept in. It was the kind of night that felt uneventful, the kind that faded into memory without a second thought. The doors were shut, the lights turned off one by one. The world outside had gone still, the deep woods surrounding the cabin wrapping it in silence. But when the sun rose the next morning, everything had changed. Sheila returned home around 7 a.m., walking the short distance back from her friend's house. It was early, the air still cool, the town just beginning to wake. She reached the porch, pushed the door open, expecting to hear the usual morning sounds inside, maybe the voices of her brothers, the clatter of breakfast being made. But there was nothing. Then her eyes adjusted. And she saw. She didn't scream at first. Didn't move. Just stood there, frozen in place, staring at something that didn't make sense. Her mother. Her brother. His best friend. Their bodies, tied. Unrecognizable. The living room that had been so warm and full of life just hours before was now a scene she could never have imagined. And then came the silence. The kind that stretches on too long. The kind that suffocates. Something was missing. Someone was missing. And Sheila didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Sheila Sharp stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Her mind struggled to make sense of what her eyes were seeing, but there was no way to rationalize it. The warmth of home, the place that had always been a refuge, had been replaced with something else entirely. The air inside was thick, suffocating, carrying the sharp metallic scent of blood. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, cast by the morning sun filtering through the curtains. But the light did nothing to soften what lay before her. Her mother was there, but she wasn't moving. Neither was John. Neither was Dana. They were bound, wrists and ankles twisted at odd angles, gagged with strips of medical tape that had done nothing to quiet their suffering. Their bodies bore the evidence of something brutal, something that had taken time. John's face was unrecognizable, swollen beyond human features. Dana lay beside him, his body twisted, unnatural, as if he had fought until the very last moment. And Sue, her mother, was on her side, hands tied tightly with electrical cord, her blouse ripped open, a deep gash across her chest. Sheila wanted to call out to them, to shake them awake, to wake herself up. But reality had already taken hold. Her stomach lurched, her knees buckled, and before she could stop it, a scream tore through her throat loud enough to split the morning silence, loud enough to wake the neighbors. And yet, inside that cabin, there was only stillness. Panic took over. She turned, stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold in her desperation to get away. The cabin that had been filled with life just the night before now felt hollow, empty, something no longer meant to be stepped inside. Somewhere in the chaos of her own thoughts, one realization clawed its way to the surface. Tina wasn't there. Greg, Rick, and Justin, just children, were found unharmed in a small bedroom at the back of the cabin, huddled together, untouched by whatever nightmare had unfolded just a few feet away. But Tina was only 12 years old, still just a child. The authorities arrived quickly, their presence felt before it was seen. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires, the click of car doors, the heavy boots of officers stepping onto the wooden porch. Their faces were unreadable as they crossed the threshold, their expressions carefully composed. But that control cracked the moment they stepped inside. What they saw wasn't just violent, it was beyond comprehension. The blood hadn't just pooled beneath the bodies, it was smeared across the walls, streaked in patterns that made no sense. A knife lay discarded, its blade bent, as if the force used had been more than it could withstand. A hammer rested nearby, its handle slick. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the brutality inflicted on the victims themselves. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, nothing to suggest that anyone had fought their way in or out. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this hadn't needed to break in. And that wasn't the only thing that didn't fit. The level of violence suggested rage, yet there were strange inconsistencies. The scene was chaotic, yet certain details felt deliberate. It was personal, yet it left behind an air of detachment, as if whoever was responsible had taken their time, had known exactly what they were doing. And then, among the carnage, there was something else. Something small. Something that didn't belong. A single fingerprint. It was left behind as if it were waiting to be found. But whose was it? In the hours before dawn, while the rest of Ketty remained locked in silence, a phone rang. It was brief, just a few rings before it stopped. No one remembers exactly when it happened, only that it was sometime after midnight, sometime before the world outside cabin 28 changed forever. A call that would have been lost to the rhythm of an ordinary night, if not for what came after. Who was on the other end of that line? What was said? And why, in the hours that followed, did no one hear the horror unfolding inside that small wooden cabin? The questions piled up faster than answers. Investigators moved through the scene with careful steps, trying to make sense of the chaos left behind. Every detail felt like a contradiction. A crime so violent, yet carried out with a level of control that suggested purpose. A struggle so brutal, yet the younger boys remained asleep, untouched, as if the walls themselves had swallowed the sounds of what happened just outside their door. Then there was the matter of the weapons. A knife, its blade bent from the force used against its victims. A hammer, its handle still sticky with blood. These were left behind, discarded like afterthoughts. But there should have been more. The wounds told a story of something larger, something heavier. Blunt force trauma, deep lacerations, injuries inflicted with precision. More than one person, more than one weapon. And yet, as officers combed through the scene, the most crucial pieces were missing. The instruments of death had vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness that crept through the trees that night. Then came the discovery of something far more chilling. Sue, John, and Dana had been bound with electrical wiring, knotted tightly, restricting movement. The knots were intricate, precise. Not something done in haste, but with intent. The kind of restraint that suggested the person tying them had done it before. The details grew stranger with every passing moment. The front door was shut, undisturbed. No broken locks, no shattered windows. It was as if whoever had done this had walked in as easily as someone coming home. As if they knew exactly where to go, exactly what they were looking for. And yet, 2 young boys had slept through it all. Just feet away. The cabin was small, walls thin, yet not one of them woke up. Not to the sound of struggle. Not to the cries for help. Not to the chaos that had unfolded in the very same home where they lay sleeping. It was almost impossible to believe. Unless they hadn't been meant to wake up at all. And then there was Tina. Her absence left an emptiness in the crime scene, a void more unsettling than anything else. She wasn't just missing, she had been taken. No ransom note. No forced abduction. It was as if she had simply been plucked from the cabin, carried off into the night while her family lay lifeless behind her. But why? Why her, and no one else? Theories formed, whispers passed between investigators behind closed doors. Was she a witness? A target? A tragic afterthought? The questions pressed in from all sides, heavy and unanswered. For years, the case remained frozen in time. Clues scattered like fragments of a puzzle that refused to come together. Leads went cold, suspects emerged and faded away. And through it all, one thing remained certain: somewhere, out there, someone knew the truth. Someone had carried the weight of that night with them, living their life as if nothing had happened. And then, 3 years later, a breakthrough. But not the kind anyone had been hoping for. The call came without warning. An anonymous voice on the other end of the line, calm, deliberate. The kind of voice that didn't waver, didn't hesitate. A voice that knew exactly what it was doing. It was April 1984, 3 years since the night the Sharp family's world was ripped apart, 3 years since Tina had disappeared without a trace. In all that time, there had been no sightings, no ransom demand, no proof of life or death. Just silence. An agonizing, endless silence. Until now. The caller didn't identify himself. He didn't explain how he knew what he was about to say. He simply told the dispatcher what to look for, and where to find it. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. Authorities followed the directions given in the call, venturing deep into the woods nearly 100 miles away from Ketty, into an isolated stretch of land where no one had reason to go. It was remote, untouched, far from any homes or well-worn trails. A place that had no connection to the Sharp family. A place Tina never should have been. And yet, there she was. Or what was left of her. The remains were scattered small, brittle fragments of bone, a human skull resting beneath a layer of leaves and dirt. There was nothing else. Nobody. No clear indication of how she had died. Only the distant echoes of what had happened to her after she was taken from that cabin 3 years earlier. But there was one thing that stood out. One thing that didn't belong in the quiet emptiness of the woods. A single scrap of duct tape. It was old now, worn by the elements, but its presence told a story of its own. Someone had used it. On her. And then there was the blouse. A faded, torn piece of fabric, long since discolored by time. It was small, meant for a child. The last trace of a girl who had been stolen from her home, a girl whose last moments remained a mystery. The discovery didn't answer any questions, it only raised more. Had Tina been alive when she was taken? Had she spent hours, days, even weeks in the hands of whoever had done this? Was she kept somewhere, hidden away until she met the same fate as the others? Or had she been killed that very same night, her body taken somewhere far from Ketty to ensure she was never found? And then there was the biggest question of all, the one that turned investigators' attention away from strangers and back towards something far more unsettling. How did the caller know exactly where to find her? Her remains hadn't been discovered by accident. No hiker had stumbled upon them, no animal had disturbed the ground. Someone had known she was there. Someone had been keeping that secret, carrying it with them all these years. And now, for reasons unknown, they had chosen to speak. But why now? And why like this? There was no confession. No regret. Just a statement of fact, given in the same way someone might recite an address or the time of day. It wasn't just the knowledge that was disturbing, it was the ease with which it was delivered. As if whoever had made that call, had been waiting. And the most unsettling part? This wasn't just an act of random violence. This was something much closer to home. There was no shortage of suspects. No shortage of whispers, of theories passed between those who had lived in Keddie long enough to know that something about this case had never sat right. The kind of theories that weren't spoken aloud in public, but in hushed voices behind closed doors. Because the truth wasn't just buried in the evidence. It was buried in the people who had been there. People who had seen things. Heard things. People who knew far more than they were willing to admit. And at the center of it all was Martin Smart. He was a man with a temper, a man known for his outbursts, the kind of man who left people on edge without even trying. He had lived just a short walk from Cabin 28, close enough to hear the sounds of life coming from the Sharps' home, close enough to know their routines. And, as some claimed, close enough to have a deep-seated hatred for John Sharp and Dana Wingate. He had reason to. He had made it clear he didn't like them, especially Dana. He thought they were trouble, thought they were disrespectful. But was that enough to lead to something this brutal? It wasn't just his temper that made people uneasy. It was what came after. Because after the murders, Martin left Keddie. Disappeared. He packed up his life and moved away, leaving behind a crime that was still fresh, a crime that had shaken the entire town. People don't just walk away from their homes for no reason. Not unless they have one. And then there was the letter. It wasn't discovered until years later, buried in old case files. A single piece of paper, written in his own hand. A message that seemed harmless at first glance, until one line stood out, stark against the rest of his words. I've paid the price for what I've done. It wasn't a confession. Not exactly. But it wasn't nothing, either. And it wasn't the only thing that pointed to him. Because his wife, Marilyn, had spoken about that night before. And what she had said was chilling. According to her, Martin had confessed. Not to the police. Not to the public. But to her. In a moment of unguarded honesty, when the weight of what had happened had pressed down just enough for something to slip through. He had told her he killed them. And yet, no one seemed to listen. No charges. No arrests. No real attempt to bring him in. And if that wasn't strange enough, there was something even more disturbing. Evidence had gone missing. Police files, reports, key documents that should have been preserved, gone. Destroyed. Vanished. As if someone had reached into the case and carefully plucked out the pieces that mattered most. The pieces that might have pointed to the truth. It was a mistake, they said. A clerical error. An accident. But how do you accidentally lose evidence in a quadruple homicide? And then there was Beau Boubaid. He was Martin's friend, a drifter with a criminal past, a man who had appeared in Keddie almost as suddenly as he had left. He and Martin had been drinking together the night of the murders. They had both left town shortly after. And Beau. He was no stranger to violence. There were people who swore the two of them had something to do with it. That it wasn't just one man who had walked into that cabin that night, but two. That what happened wasn't random, wasn't just a moment of rage. It was something planned. Something carried out with purpose. But if that was true, why was no one held accountable? How could a crime so brutal, so savage, leave behind no convictions? Unless someone didn't want it solved. Unless someone made sure it never would be. If someone wanted this crime buried, they succeeded. But the real question is, why? The years passed, but time did nothing to dull the fear. It clung to Keddie like a shadow, stretching long over the quiet town, refusing to fade. People moved on. Families came and went. But the memory of what happened inside cabin 28 never left. There were those who tried to forget. Who told themselves it was in the past, that whatever evil had come through that night had gone with it. But there were others who couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. That the story wasn't over. Because no one had paid for what happened. No one had answered for the lives taken. And that meant that somewhere, someone was still carrying that secret. For years, the cabin stood untouched, its windows dark, its walls heavy with the weight of what they had seen. People avoided it, glancing away as they passed, unwilling to acknowledge the ruin that had been left behind. Until finally, they tore it down. There was no ceremony. No announcement. Just the quiet, deliberate dismantling of a place that had become synonymous with fear. Some believed it was for the best. That the cabin itself had held on to something, and by removing it, they were erasing the stain it had left behind. But others knew better. Because a house is just wood and nails. But what happened there? That can't be torn down. That lingers. That stays. The case never officially closed, but it might as well have. The years turned to decades, the faces of investigators changed, and the files gathered dust. Every now and then, new theories would surface. A witness would come forward with a memory they hadn't shared before. A piece of overlooked evidence would be re-examined. For a brief moment, there would be hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth was within reach. And then, as always, it would slip away. But one thing remains certain. This wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. Someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened in cabin 28 that night. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a message. Or maybe, it was a warning. One that still echoes in the silent woods of Keddy. So tell me, what do you think really happened inside cabin 28? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more unsettling true crime mysteries, don't forget to subscribe. Because the truth, it's always waiting, in the dark.